If someone is a liar and someone else gives them a stage, how can you believe those providing the stage if they say they're going to stop the lies from being heard? Which goes to the heart of European Union plans to prevent companies such as Facebook, etc., from spreading disinformation. Is it at all possible? This is Roundtable. Welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. Well, the European Union is introducing new rules to prevent what it calls dangerous and untrustworthy content appearing online, uncovering the untruths and making tech giants pay the price if they don't. Or so it says. For the past decade, the European Union has been trying to tackle the power of big tech, but critics believe it's done little to change behaviour. The Digital Services Act and its accompanying Digital Markets Act will now lay out strict conditions for doing business in the EU's 27 member countries. The aim is to curb the spread of disinformation and hate speech online, as well as big tech's business dominance. Some of the sites that would be subject to stricter regulation are Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Snapchat. The landmark proposal could shake up the way big tech does business by threatening massive fines or bans from the European market. So is the EU helping to turn the tide against online lies and propaganda? And are the tech giants doing enough? I'm very pleased to say that we can welcome back to the round table on this occasion Adi Kohler, Editor-in-Chief at the Journal of Data Protection and Privacy. And once again, we say hello to Maria Farrell, an Internet Policy Analyst, and welcoming for the first time, delighted to do so, Julien Oez, European Affairs Analyst. This is a question for you all to consider, but I'll kick off, Adi, if I may, with you. Are any of the penalties that could be imposed under these new laws severe enough to make the tech companies terrified of breaking them?
It's a good question to start with, looking at fines and sanctions as a lever for changing behaviour. The clue is to look at what's happened already. We've had some big fines with Facebook, for example, and others. Have they changed their behaviour? I don't think so. I don't think they're a sufficient deterrent, and I think that's why we're looking at legislation both at a European level and in other countries to actually force them to change their ways.
Well, we'll look at how that might work in just a moment. Maria, I don't know whether I got it right, but it appeared to me that you were nodding in agreement with what Adi said. You need something a bit stronger than this.
Well, it's hard to know exactly what to do, because what's really at issue here is the business model. It is highly profitable for these companies to traffic in disinformation. So disinformation makes a lot of money. The DSA proposes to do a 6%, up to a 6% fine of a company's annual revenue. But number one, these companies have incredibly clever tax lawyers, and it's really hard to know what their profit is in a year at all. So, and number two, as Adi says, the fines that have been levied under previous laws have not been a disincentive, even though some of the numbers are eye-watering to people like you and me, hundreds of millions of euro. But to those companies, it's barely 1% of that day's revenue. So I'm not sure that just a big fine is going to do the job.
OK, so some of the problems identified, instead of misinformation, I'm going to start calling them lies, companies that put lies out there. Julien, do you believe this act serves any fit purpose?
Well, I think that's a good start, and that's any attempt to try and work on the issue of combating misinformation and disinformation is a good one. We've had
Shall we say lies?
We can say lies. We've recently had a case of this in France, for example, where Jean-Luc Mélenchon started spreading wild conspiracy theories live on television, and for all intents and purposes, he was lying. And the issue is that the EU needs to figure out a system using its normative, and massive normative power, to try to influence global regulations. But the problem is, as my fellow panelists here have said, this isn't necessarily being done in the correct way, or to the point where it's actually going to have an impact or be punitive enough for many of these mega corporations to take notice.
So how do you go about making them take notice?
Well, effectively, like Maria just said, we need to figure out a system where the penalties are actually effective and actually able to dissuade this act. I mean, it took a while to push Facebook, for example, to take down Donald Trump, despite the fact that he was spreading lies constantly. And I know there was the facade of he's the president, we can't just deplatform him. But the problem is that throughout all the time that he was president, the damage was done. And one of the big issues that I'm seeing with this proposed regulation and the proposed new movement is that a lot of the time, and this is something that's not discussed quite enough, we're spending so much time focusing on the Facebooks and the Googles of the world and of the business world, and we're not necessarily paying attention to how these kinds of punitive measures, which, as Maria said, isn't very effective at dissuading Facebook, could have a disastrous effect on smaller businesses that are trying to break into the industry. And this can be very, very dangerous.
But not just the smaller businesses trying to break into the industry that perhaps tell the truth, but what about those smaller websites? Adi, you were a journalist at BBC World, weren't you, for a long time? What about those websites that become simply news outlets, news in quotes, that people go to and are spreading disinformation, spreading lies the entire time? Why is this going to disincentivize them?
I think we've got a very different media landscape to the one when I was working at the BBC, both in network and the World Service, where you had fewer choices. Interestingly, the media landscape has changed, where there's many more media channels now. So we've got what we call a fragmentation of media, and we've also got a fragmentation of audience as well as a result of that. If you talk to my children, I call them children, that's being a bit rude. They're 19 and 30. They'd kill me if I told them they were children.
Believe me, mine are in their 30s and they're still children.
But if you talk to young people today and you ask them, where'd you get your news from? It's unlikely to be the BBC or this august channel as well. It's likely to be via these networks, these social media networks. And the problem with that is it's highly selective. The content is very selected before they've reached it. They don't really know what's going on, only choose to see what they want to see or hear or learn about. And I think there's a fundamental problem here, David, and I'll be interested to hear what the other panelists think. But we don't have a definition of what is true. What we decide to broadcast on the news actually is what we decide to be, what we think the news is going to be. There's no absolute truth. And a lot of the time we're talking about lies, but actually are we qualified to definitely check 100% that what we're hearing is factually correct?
Yeah, so we will get the other thoughts on that in just a moment, but let me throw this thought out there. Maria, you can come back on it first of all. If you have a massive conglomeration, if you have a Google, a Facebook, a TikTok, whatever it happens to be, they are not likely to be able to start up again almost immediately if they are hit with something extremely punitive. But the smaller websites that spread these lies, this disinformation, whatever you want to call it, this news, you could call it, could just start up in another form tomorrow because it's not difficult to do that. So how do you regulate for them?
I mean, I think it's a bit of a red herring, to be honest, because most of the disinformation is coming through the larger platforms. And look, I'm the last person who's going to defend big tech. You know, I have a lot of problems with those companies and how they act. But they are simply one node in a very, very complex and really directed disinformation ecosystem. So there are, many governments, many state actors who are strategically using disinformation campaigns, for example, to spread disinformation about COVID vaccination in order to create unease in their rival countries.
You see, isn't that part of my point, that I was saying that there are so many others out there? We may be concentrating on the big ones, but it's the myriad websites out there that actually probably need better policing than these ones.
Well, there are two things going on. So one is you have, we're dealing with state actors who are using a network that already exists. So if you want to deal with the problem, you have to face up to the fact that it's state actors. But they're so successful at this because they're exploiting the business model. And until you change the business model of big tech, you're not going to do anything by having big fines. Big fines are useful because, they show that a government is really serious about dealing with a problem. But what they don't do is get at the center of it is how ad tech, serving up advertisements that are based on volume, that are responsive to people's emotions and make them click through. That is why we have this problem. So, having a directive, and I think it is a decent directive, and I actually think of all the laws out there, it's the most effective one I've seen. Yeah. But having a directive that tries to say, look, big tech, please try and do a little bit less disinformation so that you destroy democracy just a little bit less. Yes. That's not going to fix the problem. You have to change the business model and regulate the business model out of business.
We will come on to one of the business side of things. Artie, give it a second if you don't mind. We'll come on to the business side in just a moment, if we may. But Julien, I saw you nodding. There was something you wanted to add to what you heard from Maria?
Well, I think that it is important to add that this is, for all intents and purposes, a good directive. It's just that some of the actions, and I share the analysis of many, many organizations and analysts out there, that sometimes it's targeting the wrong organizations, sometimes it's too broad. And for example, there's even the issue where this doesn't necessarily tackle the root causes of what's actually happening with misinfo and disinfo, or as we may call it in some cases, lying, in that many people simply do not have the education to be able to really fact-check, and critically think their way through these issues. Let's just look at Brexit, for example. How many people actually knew what the EU was before then? Even across the EU, even in very pro-EU countries like in France, you've got many people who don't actually understand how the EU functions. And this leaves it extremely vulnerable to misinformation.
Okay, so you have two problems here. One is the fact that the fines perhaps won't be big enough because companies could hide their true worth. The second is it's very hard to tell what the truth is in many instances, and whether somebody's telling the lies about the European Union or not, which then sort of brings me to this. This is from the European Commission, a document written before these new measures came in. And it goes, one area in particular where the code has failed to, this is the previous code, has failed to achieve sufficient progress is in the demonetization of disinformation. In other words, making millions telling lies, where online advertisements still continue to incentivize the dissemination of disinformation, the putting out there of lies. Artie, I know you wanted to say something else, but this is the issue, isn't it? It's not, they're not putting it out there because they aren't looking to see whether it's true or not. They're putting it out there because it makes them a bundle.
The fundamental principle is very straightforward, really. People expect to get these services for free, and it's not really for free. What they're doing is they're giving data, their personal data, and more importantly, how they're behaving. That's then being sold onto third parties, advertisers. And that's the business model. The internet is a massive surveillance operation. And until we start to change behavior and expect to get people to pay for these tools that they want, and they expect them to get them for free, so that's not going to happen. But if we were to get them to pay for what they are using, a lot of what we're talking about today might well become redundant, because unless you are prepared to pay for it, you won't receive it for free.
But I see a problem with that, and that is that if somebody really wants you to have the information, it would be tantamount to sort of flying over Germany during the Second World War, dropping propaganda leaflets. They would put it out there for free. It's only the other sites that wouldn't.
Yeah, but there's a lot of business being made on a huge number of quite dubious content, as we hear pretty much every day. Terrorists, abusers, you name it. They appear to be getting huge amount of traffic, and the companies, the channels, the broadcasters, if you like, are making huge amounts of money out of this. And I think that's the problem. The business model is broken.
Okay, Maria, you were looking very interested in what Artie was saying. Chip in.
Yeah, so I'm going to chip in with saying, so what's going on is that the business model amplifies the bad stuff and it doesn't amplify the good stuff. And that's not necessarily because, Mark Zuckerberg is a bad human. It's simply because his business is set up to make money when we click. So we have a huge amplification engine that's going on. And I think it's always so important to me to say in these conversations that we are not seeing a proliferation of left-wing or social democratic content going around the world. We are seeing a proliferation of hard right political messaging. And the social media ecosystem, it has been absolutely instrumental in a wave of hard right political leaders coming to power around the world. And so
but that's not about lies. That's not necessarily about disinformation. That is putting somebody else's views out there. Can you have penalties for that?
No, like 6 weeks ago, Prime Minister Modi of India was tweeting about cow urine curing COVID. Last week, President Buhari of Nigeria used Twitter to threaten physical violence and the use of state force on people in the former Biafran part
but I
of
get
Nigeria.
that. But these are two individuals, even if they are at the head of government in two particular countries.
Well, I can give you half a dozen more. I mean, we can talk about President Duterte of the Philippines, who has strategically used Facebook to come to power and to terrorize journalists.
I get that. What I'm saying is, how would these rules, any rules, stop them from doing so?
So these rules won't stop them, and I think that's why I bring this up every time, is because there's a real confluence of interest between the hard right, global political hard right, and the global media, social media companies. They have a very shared interest, even though neither of them particularly likes each other. But one has effectively used the other as a platform to amplify their message with very, very harmful consequences out in the real world.
Question remains, how do you stop that?
You take away ad tech. You use the sister regulation of the Digital Services Act is the Digital Markets Act, and it is an attempt by the European Union to force more competition into the social media and big tech marketplace. I don't think it goes far enough at all. I think it's a failure of courage.
I see another issue here is that, yes, you can tell them they have to take it down. They might recognize that they have to take it down. They may even consider it to be offensive themselves. But once it's out there, the damage is done, even if you get it down within 24 hours.
Yes, 100%. It's like once you set fire to something, that fire, the damage isn't going to go away. You may put the fire out, but then the damage is there. The ripple effect is still there. And I think there is one issue that a lot of people have raised, but I think it's important to raise during this panel, is that the issue is that we're also giving a lot of power to corporations like Twitter and Facebook to determine what is harmless or harmful content. Now, I mean, let's be entirely honest, we can very clearly identify, content disseminated by terrorists or abusers or hate speech. These aren't complicated. But then when we get to the cases of fake news that are severely damaging the confidence in government or politicians, then we have severe issues. I mean, one very good example is where Emmanuel Macron was slapped by what appears to be a royalist far-right politician who seems to have been inspired by whatever he's seen on social media, and then use that to slap the president of France very publicly. And the damage has already been done for about a decade now. People started getting wise to fake news and misinformation about maybe 8-9 years ago. It became very prominent in the media, but the issue is, the damage has been done, and we now need to wind this all back.
Got wise to the idea of fake news, but it's very difficult to spot fake news if you don't think it's fake. Ardy, let me ask you about other countries. You may want to say something else, but other countries, what they're doing. The UK is sort of following on from this, or is it doing something that's a little bit more revolutionary or not?
The UK is, if you like, which is now outside of the European Union, doing their own thing on the online safety bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, where they want to bring in more of a duty of care in relation to what happens through these social media networks. In the past, they used to say, well, look, it's not our problem, it's not our fault, we just provide the pipes. We're not responsible for the content that goes down these pipes. Those days have gone. You're totally responsible for what happens as a result of that content reaching audiences, and sometimes it's pretty nasty, as we've already heard. I'm not sure the online safety bill will succeed unless we bring in criminal sanctions, and actually directors of these organizations can be held to be accountable for a breach of their duty of care in a criminal context, particularly with hate crime on the increase, particularly with violent crime on the increase, huge number of other issues to do with young children, which again is very concerning. And I think we've got to put people in prison. I can't see any other way of using a lever that's going to create the behavior change that we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes.
Well, I happen to agree with that, but it's very difficult to know how that's going to be enforceable worldwide. Maria, I want to go back to something called the S230 in the United States. I think it came in 25, 30 years ago, which basically says, it's a law that says tech companies can't be blamed for most of their content. We're not talking about stuff to do with child pornography here. We're not talking about terrorism, but most of their content, as Adi was just saying, it's a pipe down which some sewage can flow, but they're not responsible for the pipe, although I think they should be that case. Is what we're seeing a great deal better than the S230, the very loose American way? And is there a way, as Adi suggests, of severely punishing these people, not just in their pockets, but in prison?
So the US Section 230 was actually very similar to the European e-commerce directive, which the new European directive builds on. And it's simply the idea that if you are running an internet service provider, or one of these big content distribution networks like the one that went down today, that as long as you make sure you have a proper notice and takedown, and you have due process, and you're responsive to law enforcement when they come to you, you are not going to be found legally liable. So you're not going to be sued for a bunch of money if content goes across your network. It takes the same principle as, if I put if I get a envelope out of my drawer and put a bunch of anthrax into it, and I post it to I don't even want to say to, because I feel it would be almost a threat, but if I were to post anthrax to somebody through the Royal Mail, the Royal Mail is not responsible for that. So it's that similar idea.
Well, look, I'm sorry, I can see that argument, but I think it's a specious argument, because, of course, the Royal Mail has no idea what's in its envelope, but the people who run Facebook and Twitter, all they got to do is click and they'll see what's out there. But my point is there a way of making it possible to have the kind of draconian punishments as suggested by Adi and by others, and making them stick? You do this, you go to prison.
It's really important to note, the internet is not just made up of Facebook. It is made up of a bunch of companies and services that, aren't dealing with content, but nonetheless, the stuff is going over their pipes. So we won't have the internet if we, have criminal liability all the way down the line. But yeah, absolutely. Of course, the Facebooks and the Twitters have a great responsibility. How do you make it stick? So the problem is, and I keep coming back to this because I'm no fan of these companies, but if the UK says, okay, Facebook, you are going to be found criminally responsible for content that flows over your network, no matter where it comes from, that probably sounds okay in the UK. But I can tell you what is going to happen, has happened 2 weeks ago in India, is Prime Minister Modi is going to send some thugs into the Twitter's head office in India and basically try and physically intimidate them. So everything that a democratic country does that seems sensible will be taken by an authoritarian country and done in a way that is perhaps even worse.
It seems you're sort of partly defeated before you've even started, although that's a defeatist way of looking at it. Julien, we are coming towards the end of the programme. Anything that you've thought of in your idle moments that you think could be a great deal better than this, that could work, could make the world a finer place?
One of the big things that I think we really need to stress, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will back me up on this, is that the EU has everything the EU does ripples through the world. We saw this with GDPR, where it's basically become a global standard in the way data is processed. It's even managed to influence countries such as the United States, which is no mean feat. And whatever happens when it comes to these types of measures, whether it be the DSA or the DMA or what have you, will have an impact globally. Now, I'm one of those people who also believes that, people who really engage in this practice of misinformation, disinformation, and that provoke harmful acts should be punished. And I would even argue in a criminal manner. But the problem is that to get to the point where we can analyze what these people are doing, and to get to the point where we can look at specifically what these people have done, we have to be mindful about the fact that the path to that may lead to draconian measures that would have an impact on the freedoms of people, not only in the EU or in the UK, which would likely follow the EU's lead on this anyway, regardless of the political rhetoric, but globally.
So it's freedom of speech versus the ability to be able to put out garbage that can hurt people. It is a difficult decision to make. I wish we could talk for a great deal longer. I wish we could. Sorry, that's my opinion at the end, but there we go. We've had yours for a long time, and much appreciated for all of you spending the time to come here onto Roundtable today. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Adi, thank you, Maria, and thank you, Julien. Wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable, we thank you most profoundly for taking the time to do so. Until next time, from me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, goodbye.